Hey guys, I'll get to the video real quick, but first I'd like to make an announcement. This video is a new type that I may make every now and then, where basically they'll be much shorter formatted, videos on mostly newer topics that will be very much freeform, where I won't be following a script per se, but I'll have the major talking points and we'll still have some scripted parts somewhat. These won't replace my more in-depth videos, but they'll allow me to talk about topics I want to talk about in a quicker, more consistent nature. Lastly, minor spoilers. I will be talking about the story's beginning, and I'll be showing footage from the first 3 dungeons, and around the whole point of the game. So, if you want to be completely blind, you may want to pass on this one. Anyway, with that, let's just get right into the video. Tears of the Kingdom, one of the biggest games in The Legend of Zelda's library to date. Now, some people weren't too fond of the game, and while it certainly has its problems, one of my absolute favorite mechanics was just how many ways you could use the game's tools to go about solving problems that you'll face time and time again. Fast forward a little bit, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom would be announced, and when I saw that its mechanics leaned into this design, I was really excited for it. And also, it used the same chibi art style as the Link's Awakening remake. There's no big point here or joke, I just like the art style. We start out with our hero Link raiding a conspicuous dungeon, which essentially serves as the game's tutorial for walking around and stuff, where we find Zelda captive, again, and Ganon, again. And after Link stomps Ganon out, he steps in a puddle, and apparently that puddle is deep as most teens think their Joker quotes are, as Link gets sucked in, and in his last action he fires an arrow, killing Zelda, and ending the game and a franchise as a whole. Anyway, Zelda breaks out of her rupee prison before making an escape, being picked up by some soldiers, and returning to Hyrule Castle. From there, we meet with some of the gremlins before talking to our dad, telling him what's going on, before we hear of these rifts that are opening everywhere, before suddenly, one opens up right in front of us, giving our dad and his entourage the good suck. But apparently I was wrong, because after these dark clones get spit out, apparently it was actually the bad suck, as now they are evil. Great. They throw us in the dungeons where we have to make our escape, but Zelda being Zelda and having no real tools to her, well, advantage, or use I guess, can't make it out on her own. That's when we're introduced to our partner for the game, Tri. He's this little light spirit thing that we seemingly know nothing about, but appears and offers to help us escape from this prison, clearly seemingly knowing what's going on at least more than we do. Tri not only offers to stay by our side while he helps us escape, he then gives us access to the main mechanic of the game, that being the Tri-Rod. The Tri-Rod's really interesting, and we'll get into its mechanics more in a moment, but essentially what it does for us in this instance is it allows us to copy certain objects, in this case this table. It allows us to make an escape that we wouldn't normally be able to. After which we run into Impa, who offers us a costume to potentially help hide us, since now we're actually slated to be executed. Yeah, I thought that was pretty dark, I'll be honest with you. So, considering the whole kingdom is now looking for Zelda, as the lie has been going that we're the ones causing these rifts to open, so that's gonna be great for us. We make our escape, and from there, we're shot out into the world all on our own. And that's pretty much the game's opening. There's more story, but as I said, I want to keep this as spoiler-free as I can. That's pretty much the basis you need to know. And yes, if you couldn't have gathered, that means the main character you're playing as is Zelda. This would make it the first Zelda game where you play as Zelda. Or at least the first one that doesn't suck. For a long time, a lot of people in the Legend of Zelda community have really wanted a game where you play as Zelda. Which makes sense, her name's in the title, and she seems to have different abilities than Link, which actually even take place in this game. So I was really excited to see how they'd handle this. Again, showing that Link still is in the game, but instead we're taking the perspective of Zelda having to be the one to go on this adventure instead of Link. Now, I want to immediately get across to a lot of the newer Legend of Zelda fans who may be only familiar with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that this is not quite like those games. In some ways it is, and there's a lot of openness to it, and you can explore the world in so many ways, but at first it definitely is a lot more linear. Like, for example, up to the first dungeon, you really only have one area to explore, in terms of, like, a section of the map, if you will. And it's definitely kind of like the Great Plateau, or the Great Sky Island, for, again, the people who are going off of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom for their knowledge going into this game. But it does open up pretty swiftly after that, and from there you can actually pretty much just go anywhere. Now, as I stated, if this was a Legend of Zelda game where you just play as Zelda but played the exact same as if you played as Link, it wouldn't really feel like you were playing a different character at all. And as I already mentioned, the Tri-Rod, this game does play very differently from any of the Zelda games before this one. Zelda is, at the end of the day, a princess. She's not really meant to be a fighter. Link is usually portrayed as somebody who may be a fighter, may not be. Sometimes he's just a kid who picks up a sword and for some reason is really good at using it. Sometimes he has really extensive training. But either way, Link has a much higher likelihood of knowing how to use a sword, shield, bow, arrows, and all these things. Zelda, understandably, is an aristocrat and wouldn't know these things. But Zelda is still quite capable. In almost every game, she's shown having some more magical abilities and is genuinely seen as being a smart individual. In Ocarina of Time, A Blast to the Past, she was the one who had this big idea to hopefully defend against Ganon. And though she did immediately get played by Ganon, she then had her comeuppance by coming up with an even better plan to overthrow him in the end. Or the fact that Zelda's magic is so grand, in Breath of the Wild, she spent 100 years plus sealing Ganon in the castle, just one-on-one scrapping with him until Link was ready, going on his adventure and doing this down a goddamn slope to actually come help her. Zelda is capable, but she doesn't have the same skills as Link, and that translates into this gameplay in a really interesting way. As instead of your typical sword, shield, bow, arrow, and all that, instead we have the Tri-Rod as I mentioned earlier. Your main use for this is going to be copying very specific items and enemies, which are called Echoes. These Echoes can be summoned at essentially any time, whether it be a platform to help you get to greater heights and explore different areas that you couldn't explore before, or, as I mentioned, even copy enemies after you've defeated them for the first time. This means that yes, your fighting abilities is actually reliant on others. Well, to a degree, you're more like a commander or a Pokemon trainer, to some degree. I'll get back into the combat in a second. But what's really cool about this game is that is a big incentive for you to explore. In a lot of the Legend of Zelda games in the past, like pretty much any of them, I don't even know why I'm trying to give an example, the main incentive to explore is to find chests with rupees, or sometimes better equipment, sometimes it's a side quest that can give you rupees or an empty bottle or something. And while there's certainly some of that here, like the empty bottles and whatnot, a big incentive to explore is to find these things to copy, these echoes that you can then have and use later. And you don't even need that many of them to beat the game. Sure, you're going to run across some of them in just the general gameplay, but going out of your way to get a really powerful echo ability that you can use in so many situations is something that I really enjoyed and definitely gave a really cool incentive to explore. And it was also just such a cool experience whenever you'd find a new echo, just wondering what its practical uses could be. For example, as I already mentioned the table, it really doesn't do much past that, but it can in fact catch on fire, meaning you could use it to help spread fire to different locations. One of the best ones you get early game is in the first town where you find this kid who has a trampoline. That trampoline helped me so much in the early game you have no idea. But that wonder and awe when you finally find a new echo and being able to experiment with it and find these uses is a really cool mechanic. Backtracking a little bit, however, I want to go back to what I said earlier about having to rely on others for fighting. As mentioned, Zelda is not a fighter, but you can in fact copy enemies after you've taken them out for the first time. What's interesting is that this means that you have to rely on the essential goodwill of the AI to fight for you. Because you can summon things like rocks and pots that you can pick up and throw at an enemy, sure, but that's about it at the start. You're going to be relying on some bokoblins and birds, snakes, and whatever these gel guys are. I think they were called Zols in this game instead of Choo-Choos. But you're going to have to rely on them for essentially every fight in the early game. What's interesting is that despite this being a problem to many people, as you would figure taking that much control away from the player would be annoying, I found it to be a really interesting challenge. And there's a lot of mechanics that actually I feel like are honestly a little, what's the best word for this? I guess obscure would be the best one. For example, I've seen multiple people say that they didn't know until way later in the game that you could actually help encourage what enemy you wanted your echoes to target based on if you yourself targeted the enemy using the ZL button. Something that the game itself does outright tell you, but for some reason a lot of people just forget or didn't notice. But even with that mechanic, you would still think, okay, well, having to rely on AI is quite notoriously a problem. So is it good? Is it bad? How does the AI hold up to be able to actually help you out? And I thought it was pretty good. For the most part, every single monster has one attack that they're going to continuously try to go for, with very few exceptions. For example, the basic Bokoblin has a random wooden stick he's just going to try to hit people with, and will come close to them. But later on you'll get variants with shields that will generally hold their shield up until they're ready for an attack. And enemies will counter certain types of enemies, and it's this whole sort of complicated thing, but not that complicated when you get into it. But they all interact with each other in pretty set ways, for the most part, with a few exceptions thrown in, meaning you can essentially basis what you want to throw out there based on what you're fighting. For example, if you're fighting a flying enemy, you're probably not going to want the very stagnant and not very mobile enemies like the Bokoblin. You might want to choose something that can also rival them in the air, or something that may have a giant ranged attack, such as the ranged Moblins or Bokoblins, or even the Keese, for example, if you're going against those crows. And what's cool is this is a process that you can go through for so many of the fights. Sure, later on you'll definitely get stronger echoes. In fact, I found myself relying on a set few, but the fact that this is even a thing where you want to have a few to pick through based on which situation you're in is cool, and it makes it so that way more of the echoes are relevant just simply based on the situation. In fact, even in the end game, I was still using some of the early game summons that should theoretically be weaker, but I would still summon them because they just worked better in a set situation. So of course, as I've already gathered, essentially the gameplay of battling revolves around you summoning a bad guy, having that bad guy fight the other bad guy, and hoping yours wins. So what's really your thing to do while you're in those moments? Well, the enemies are still likely going to be targeting you, and you do have set HP. You can kind of dodge with this little spin thing, which is kind of funny. It's like a play on Link's roll, but I guess since Zelda doesn't want to do the whole roll, or maybe doesn't know how to, she does the spin instead. It's really interesting. Anyway, you'll summon in, of course, these bad guys, and it's just okay, so you watch them fight. But every single thing you summon, echo-wise, has a limit. For example, as you can see those 3 triangles floating behind Tri, those are the points that you use to summon echoes, and every single echo will have a different price, so to speak. For example, some of the early game summons are only like 1 or 2, whereas a lot of the late game ones can go up to like 4 or 5. And as I stated, you'll end up getting a bunch more of these upgrades that will allow you to then summon more. But this means you can't simply summon 20 enemies on the field or keep summoning them until you win the fight. So keep that in mind, you do have this limit, and it is something that's interesting to work around, not just in battles, but going back to puzzles even too. For example, we'll go back to instances with this piece of heart. It's way higher up, and you think, okay, well, since beds I know can make a staircase, I'll just keep making them. But if you don't have enough of the triangles, that strategy's not going to work. You're going to have to come up with something else. And as I already mentioned, you can get a bunch of different pieces for both the fighting ones, like the monsters, and a bunch of platforming ones, like these water blocks, or a bunch of other ones, as I already mentioned, my favorite being the trampoline. But you'll get these sporadically throughout the game, and those will allow you to approach puzzles that you may have seen before, or new puzzles, in different, completely unique ways. So cool, you can get things like these water blocks that let you swim up and down. You get tables and beds and things like that that allow for really unique platforming challenges, which is actually really interesting because Zelda is definitely not known for being a platformer, but I actually really appreciated it and thought it was kind of a cool, well, new thing. And for the most part, the platforming is pretty nice, and though it does appear quite often, more so than you may expect, again, Zelda's not known for being a platformer, there are very few problems I had with it. Again, using the echoes and stuff to help you get around and make shortcuts I thought was really satisfying. I will say the only complaint I have is that sometimes the camera angle of being top down and sort of at a 90-degree angle doesn't feed too well in knowing the perspective of when something's higher than you or lower than you. I can't really describe it too well, but I every now and then had a problem of being able to tell where something was located in difference to my character location. Maybe this isn't a problem everyone will have, but it certainly was one that I had some challenges with. Thankfully, to counteract that, you don't take damage from voiding out in a lot of instances. The only instance I can think of is falling into lava or something. In fact, that was something that I actually had my opinion swayed on as I continued with the game. At first, when I started, I thought the game was really easy. Like, really easy. I already mentioned with when you fail a platforming segment, falling down and not taking any damage, but even the fights were pretty easy. As, yeah, you can't just summon in 2,000 enemies, but every time one dies, there's no real consequence for that. You immediately get the ability to summon them again as your triangle pieces immediately come back, and at any time if you feel like they're taking too much damage and you don't want to have to, go even a few seconds without having an enemy that can be taking hits for you, you can just summon them back in immediately. I was really torn on this. Again, at first, one of my really exciting things was I thought that it would be quite challenging to have a Zelda game without that traditional combat, and having to rely on the AI to fight. But when I actually saw what was presented, it just seemed really easy. However, this did change as I went on, and in fact, it became a lot more challenging. So I definitely think it may have just been a perspective thing, and granted, every game early on should be easy and then progressively get harder. That's just how, game design should work, at least when it's done properly. But I do want to make it known, if you go into the game expecting something that is like as hard at the beginning as a lot of other Zelda games, it's not. It's a lot more well-balanced. And it's a lot more beginner-friendly at the beginning, and then still ramps up in difficulty. And even if this is still like something you've heard before, or you go into it and even at late game think it's too easy, there is a hero mode that you can switch to at any time. So I'm glad that they did encompass a bit of everything for everybody, if you will. So, as I already had kind of mentioned, the main story revolves around you having to now rescue Link, but also having to heal these rifts that are appearing everywhere. Thanks to Tri, you can actually enter them, and this is where a lot of those platforming segments I mentioned earlier come into play. They're tiny little puzzles we have to go on getting these shadow orbs, which are Tri's friends. After you get them all, you'll clear that rift up, it'll be back to normal, and you'll have a little bit of EXP for Tri, which will eventually level him up. But what's interesting is I figured that there would be, kind of like shrines for the past games. And again, I was pretty spoiler-free going into it. I wanted to have a very unadulterated experience of the game where I had very little going into it. I knew about it being a Zelda game where you were playing as Zelda, and I knew that its mechanics were a lot more similar to Tears of the Kingdom than many of the other games. But believe it or not, it actually is a lot more like some of those older games in a lot of unique ways. Dungeons, for example, are back. As I already mentioned in just the disclaimer of this video, the first 3 dungeons, for example, I already spoiled that they're dungeons from that alone. The dungeons themselves are designed really well, and again, for the sake of not trying to spoil too much, I will be showing footage, but I won't be really talking too in-depth about them, but I do think that they are well designed, especially around the mechanics of being able to solve a puzzle in multiple different ways. In fact, that's going to lead me into what is without doubt my favorite thing about Echoes of Wisdom. So, to give a little bit of context about who I'm going to go into, I have a brother. I love him to death, he loves video games, but we have a lot of different tastes in games, where I like my games that have a big immersive world that I can really get lost in, that feels real. He likes small hallways that are very much linear, that he just can go from point A to point B. That's just how he enjoys his games, and I enjoy mine differently, which is fine. I know there are people who would go to both sides of both arguments in terms of which one you enjoy more. But I want to explain really quickly about this open world style that I've always found fascinating and have always enjoyed, and trust me, this will lead back into Echoes of Wisdom and Tears of the Kingdom, I promise. Now, this doesn't apply to every open world game. Your Skyrims and Fallouts don't really lean into this too much, but when it comes to games that are a lot more like Breath of the Wild, where it's open and you have all these mechanics that are available, that can be used, that's what I want to touch on. With open world games, you have a lot of potential for what you can allow your player to do. Open world itself is essentially just a giant sandbox that you are letting the player explore at their own pace and of their own will. For me personally, I'll lean this back to Tears of the Kingdom, again, just because I think it's the one that is most recent of the major Zelda titles, and it's the one that I, myself, compared this to in terms of its major mechanics with the Echo Rod. One of my favorite parts of Tears of the Kingdom, as I even mentioned in the intro, was just how open-ended every single part of everything thrown at you was. The game had so many well-designed mechanics based around the Ultra Hand, being able to create your own types of puzzle-solving mechanics. For example, you could make your own cars and things like that, and every single puzzle was unique in the fact that, yeah, sure, there may have been some intended ways specifically to deal with them, but that doesn't mean that those are the ways that you have to solve them. And I guess that could go for any puzzle game, but in this instance, it's quite special and different in a unique way. In the case of Tears of the Kingdom or Echoes of Wisdom, the main charm for me leans into the mechanics that are given to you by the developers themselves. For example, all of the echoes that you have in Echoes of Wisdom, or back to Tears of the Kingdom, all of the things that the Ultra Hand can be connected with, and all of the little tools and pieces that are handed to you, the player, to be able to design and come up with your own strategies moving forward in this whole world that they created. With games like the base or older Legend of Zeldas, every puzzle was pretty much a one and done. There was one singular solution that would solve the puzzle, and from there, that would allow you to move on. It was the puzzle that the developer made with one specific notion involved, and they give you just enough tools to potentially get stumped on it, and eventually have to find out. But for the most part, the puzzles were never that intense, and as mentioned, they always had that singular solution. This isn't a problem, and again, games like this are still fun. I still have a lot of fun with those older Zelda games, but I'm saying what's really cool about these new ones is what they allow you to do with these new mechanics that are being presented. The developers of both Tears of the Kingdom and Echoes of Wisdom gave a bunch of tools to the player themselves and essentially just said, do what you want. Have fun, come up with your own puzzles, and find your own solutions and make this journey your own. It's your own experience of the game, and you can experience it in legitimately your own way. Sure, there are some puzzles that are pretty point blank and seem pretty obvious. It could just be a simple trampoline, for example, that you need to place. But that doesn't mean every single puzzle is going to be played this way for every person. Every single puzzle has the chance to be completely different based on every single player's experience. And easily the biggest strength that the developers get out of this is when you give the tools to a player that allows them to then discover things that let them feel like they're breaking your game. And I'm not talking about actual things that break their game. I'm talking about things that don't legitimately break their game but feel like they do, okay? What I mean by this is, example A, look at me entering this cave. I see a heart piece. I want the heart piece. Now, what the game most likely intends for you to do is to go around this long cave, get a free echo here and there, and eventually get to the heart piece. It's not by any means a hard cave, and it's definitely something you're going to probably likely run into early on in the game if you're checking every corner like a lot of Zelda players do. But I had the inclination to try to get it in a different way. I used the mechanics that had been given to me, the echoes I had achieved up to that point, and eventually came up with a way to in fact reach the heart piece in what felt like an unintended way. But you can kind of see they didn't really do anything to try to prevent the player from reaching it. There's no invisible wall, there's no one-way type of torrent of water or something. It's literally just an open space, and you can go about it, getting it however you want. Do you want to go the intended... I use intended with air quotes, by the way, the intended long route of the cave, or do you want to try to take a shortcut? This sort of stuff applied so often throughout the gameplay, even up to the very end. There were so many moments where I myself actually felt like I was breaking the game just with how I felt like I knew the mechanics. And that is brilliant game design. When your mechanics are so in-depth and thorough that you can give every single player, depending on how they're viewing the game, the feeling of mastery over your mechanics to the point where they feel like they're breaking and outsmarting you, the game designer, by how they're playing, that's great game design. Because not only are your mechanics thorough enough to be able to actually allow those things, but you're also encouraging it by giving these player all those tools. And when the player actually feels like they've outsmarted the game developer and have actually overcome this level of intelligence, it really just makes you feel proud of yourself. That's the whole reason you play puzzles anyway, like in games or stuff, is for that aha moment where you understand and feel like you've beaten or given a bit of a checkmate, if you will, to the developer themselves. It's cool, it's enjoyable to solve puzzles and have that aha, I get it moment. But in cases like Tears of the Kingdom and, again, Echoes of Wisdom, the main aha moment doesn't just come from solving the puzzle, but from solving the puzzle in a way that makes it feel unique to you and your experiences and knowledge of that game. You don't just have to know, oh, there's a crack in the wall, I'm going to place a bomb there. Or, the developers definitely meant for me to place a bomb right here and drop it into the eye of the Dodongo's cave to open the cave. That is the only solution to that puzzle. But here, not even just with the heart piece, but everywhere in Echoes of Wisdom, there are multiple ways to solve multiple problems given to you. Like these switches that you have to time your jumps perfectly. I don't even know if I have footage of this. Again, this is mostly off script. I don't know if I have footage of this. But there's these switches you have to hit the same time that are like halfway across the room. And you could easily solve this with the Armos Echo as they go back and forth, kind of like a Koopa in the old 2D Mario games. Anyway, you can do that, or you can do what my stupid butt did, because I didn't have the Armos one at the time, is I just placed a bunch of echoes around the room. I put a box on the switch itself, and then I put something else above the box, and made it so that eventually when I made an echo, the box that was on the button would disappear, and the other item that was on top of the box would fall on it, pressing the switch again, and I would just time it so that I'd place an echo, I'd jump on the switch, and then that item would land on the other switch at the same time. I know that was a long and convoluted thing, and again, I may not have footage to even properly describe this, but that sort of stuff is what I'm talking about. And while I'm not saying that this should necessarily replace, or as I said, isn't necessarily better than some of the older design choices and philosophies of older games, no. But I am saying for games like this, it works really well. So yeah, that's your main mechanic. You go around Hyrule, you collect things, you get into side quests, and those are your main mechanics. It's using echoes along the way to solve different puzzles and problems in ways that you never had to before. But when it comes down to it, it's still a Zelda game. Everything that's enjoyable about many of the older titles is still here. From quirky characters, to quirky quests, to quirky rewards, it's all here. Everything that you could find enjoyment in a lot of the older Zelda games with the exploration, and the character design, and even the story, is still present. And I think it's a game that, even if you didn't think you'd be too into it based on your love for Tears of the Kingdom or some of the more modern Zelda games, I think this is a good one to ease players into those games. A big thing about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is that they are very unlike the rest of the Zelda series in a lot of ways. They definitely have similarities, don't get me wrong, but gameplay-wise, it's a definitely different and unique experience. I think that Echoes of Wisdom is a really good way of being able to allow not just new players into this mechanic and to these things that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom presented, but I think it's also just a great game to get new people into the franchise, understanding where some of the older Zelda game magic is, and allow them to experience that while still seeing what will eventually go into games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Okay, so I've been very generous to the game, and I've talked about a lot of the things I enjoy as spoiler-free as I can. But, of course, we always gotta talk about the negatives. What are the things that I didn't enjoy about the game or I found frustrating? The thing I already mentioned was the platforming. Sometimes the perspective was a little off. So I'll skip past that. So let's just go to the next thing. But realistically, I actually didn't have too many complaints with the game itself, anyway. The music was memorable, and I loved all the different times we got the Zelda motif thrown into different tracks. The character designs were great, as I mentioned earlier, and seeing a lot of Majora's Mask representation with like the Deku race being back in here made me so happy. But of course, yeah, I do have some problems with it. Here is another minor spoiler alert. 3, 2, 1. Eventually, you fight a shadowy version of Link, and he drops his sword. This sword is kind of like another form that you can take on for a limited amount of time. This bar up here, it's kind of like magic, if you will. And this allows you to have Link's moveset temporarily. And later on, you even get extensions to this like the bow and some other stuff. It's cool being able to play as Link in a Zelda game, but I am kind of torn on this. For one, as I already mentioned, one of the things I was most excited for was having a Zelda game without that traditional combat system, or without the traditional controls really at all. And being able to see and use Zelda's strengths throughout the entire thing was one of the things I was really excited about. And to see that that could be bypassed in a lot of ways was kind of frustrating to me. Now, I want to be fully transparent that the time limit is pretty strict, and you're not going to get a ton of time with it, and you're not going to be able to just run around without, having to turn it off. Definitely, without a doubt, you're going to be spending the most time using the Echo Rod and having to use those mechanics. But the fact that you could trivialize so many fights with this thing is kind of disappointing to me. The most fun I had was when I forced myself to use the Echo Rod in situations where I could have just switched to Link. Which, when I say forced myself, it makes it sound a lot less fun than it was. But the reason I say I'm torn on this is because I think realistically this was the right decision. Because, simply put, having to rely on the AI for, let's see, boss hits, for example, would not be very fun. Yes, you do have to rely on them in a lot of fights, but having to rely on them for this segment where they fall on the ground and you're supposed to just do damage would have been really annoying. And there are times where you just don't want to deal with the AI, and of course, having to always deal with an AI, no matter how good it would be infuriating. That feeling of, okay, I guess I wish I could do it myself is prevalent, but for the most part, and if this game didn't have that mechanic, you wouldn't be able to. You would just be frustrated continuously about the game's AI and how infuriating it can be at times, despite me thinking it was pretty good overall. So I think that the mechanic needed to be here, so that way you could have that moment of, I'm doing it myself because frick this sucks. But it is still certainly frustrating that this kind of torn relationship I have with it. It's frustrating because it was implemented well enough, they have that time limit and everything, but I would have killed to have a Zelda game that completely just abandoned the way that Link normally plays. But as I said, I'll be entirely honest with you, that's pretty much the only real complaint I have that has any merit to me. The story was really fun, I liked the character designs, I liked the music, the gameplay itself was phenomenal, I really enjoyed it. I don't have too many negatives that make me bring this game down by any means. Do I think that it excels in a lot of these aspects? Not necessarily. For example, I don't think that this is going to be changing everyone's perspective on storytelling, like people thought the Mario movie would for some reason. But I do think that its gameplay is definitely its strongest element, and is something that a lot of people could enjoy. Unfortunately, I'm kind of scared for this game. I haven't even looked at the sales, and I'll probably throw them on screen of what they currently are if I can even find anything that says that. But I have a feeling that this game, similar to Princess Peach's Showtime, is going to be quite undersold, despite it being a stellar game overall. One of the reasons could just be the fact that, you know, Super Princess Peach was just called Princess Peach Showtime. It was kind of its own thing. At least this shares the title of The Legend of Zelda, so I think it's a lot more likely that fans will just cling onto it because it shares the name. But I think another problem is just that when you see it next to Tears of the Kingdom, what would you sooner want to spend $60 on? Would you want to spend $60 on Tears of the Kingdom, which is this huge open world, 200-hour plus game that you could spend so much time getting lost in? Or are you going to spend $60 playing the Zelda game that has around 30 hours of gameplay, and it's not an open world game, but In the end, answering what value it has to you and how much you want to play it, that's going to come down to the person. I think that everything that I saw about the game, and just to note, by the time of me actually recording this audio, I have beaten the game. I thought the experience was really good. I definitely can see, similar to some other games, why people probably wouldn't want to spend $60. The biggest thing is always, okay, well, what else could I get for that money, right? And in the case of The Legend of Zelda as a franchise, I definitely still think that Tears of the Kingdom is a better game. But they're so different that it's hard for me to even say that, because they're not like you can really compare them necessarily. I do think Princess Peach? What? I do think that Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is a great game, and I think and hope that many people should, and hopefully they will, give it a try, because it's a really fun Zelda game. And with this most likely being the last Zelda game we're getting on the Switch before we see their next console, I'm satisfied, and I'm looking forward to what the team does with the future of this. They brought back the old 2D top-down style Zelda games again, and maybe we'll see more of these, maybe we'll see more Breath of the Wild, who knows. But all I do know is that it's a good game, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to get into the series, or even some fans who may not have thought they'd be too into it. I'd say if you can find it for a decent price, just give it a try. It's a lot more fun than I think a lot of people made it seem, based on just the gameplay trailers. I think it's a lot more fun than people think. Either way, with that being said, I'm going to get back to working on that super long video that hopefully will be coming out by the end of this month. And I want to thank you all so very much for listening to me ramble. As I mentioned, this is a new type of video I'm not going to be doing super often, but every now and then it will be something I do that's heavily unscripted. Either way, hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.